My name is Larry Cohn, and I want to welcome everybody and thank you all for coming to this morning's program. I first met Irene Rosenschein about 15 years ago, and like many, many others, I was immediately taken in by her radiant smile and her seemingly unbreakable positive presence. In the days and weeks that followed, though, I heard Irene's stories of degradation and worse during the Holocaust. You'll hear some of these stories in Irene's own words in a few minutes. Yet Irene had such a presence of positivity and of gratitude, despite all the unimaginable horrors and dislocations she experienced. She was, of course, indelibly marked by these events, but refused to be defined by them. Irene embraced each day with a resolute life force, appreciative of every moment. She came to understand a survivor's need, if not responsibility, to make sure that the stories of the Holocaust did not die with the 6 million. Indeed, Irene seized the opportunity to make her history a living history by telling of her experiences. I know there are countless others like me who learned invaluable life lessons about faith, resiliency, the power of human determination, and yes, gratitude from listening to Irene. She spoke to bar and bat mitzvah classes, to students in Boulder public schools, actually to anyone who expressed an interest. More than once when I visited Irene in rehab did I find a nurse or aide wrapped and in tears as they heard, many for the first time, details of the incomprehensible barbarities Jews like Irene suffered under the Nazis. Through all of her interactions, Irene was a force for remembrance of the Holocaust. But survivors such as Irene, who can bear firsthand witness to the atrocities, are leaving us. With the passing of our survivor storytellers, the lessons to be learned from the Holocaust, the singular example of man's inhumanity to man, are at the risk of being lost as well. How do we know this is happening? A 2020 study by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany found that almost a quarter, 22% of Generation Z and millennials in the United States were unaware or not sure if they had heard of the Holocaust. 41% of millennials and 31% overall believed that fewer than 2 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. 66% of millennials and 41% overall were unable to identify Auschwitz. And 58% believed that something like the Holocaust could happen again. As the Holocaust becomes an increasingly distant point in world history, it is essential that we not only remember it and learn its eternal lessons, but at least as important is to ensure that the next generations know the important details, the causes and the killings of this horrific genocide. It is only through education that we can fix this problem of detachment. And here the Claims Conference survey provides a measure of hope. 93% of respondents believe that all students should learn about the Holocaust in school. And 80% said it's important to keep teaching the Holocaust so it doesn't happen again. I provided the seed funding for the JCC's Holocaust Education Fund for the dual purposes of honoring the memory of my dear friend Irene, and also as a step to reducing this alarming ignorance. To do so, the fund will support annual Holocaust educational programming for all ages and segments of the Boulder community, from students to seniors, Jewish or not, so that we in Boulder can do our part to fill the widening gaps in Holocaust knowledge, to be, as Irene was, a force for remembrance. You can join me in doing this on the JCC page. There's a restricted fund for the endowment fund at your convenience. And now we will have a short video in Irene's own words.
My name is Irene Rosenschein. I was born in Kirajas, which is the Carpathen. My father was a butcher He had 2 butcher stores. We had a very large family, with 5 boys and 5 girls. We lived a very simple life. Everybody was struggling to make a living. Most of the Jews in our town were either tailors or shoemakers, dealers. My favorite thing was riding the bicycles, going to the Tisa in the summer to the river and swim and bathe. It was wonderful. During the Sabbath and the holidays, we used to go and hike into the mountains. Even though we were dressed very beautifully in Sabbath clothes, we had a beautiful childhood, very loving, great respect, never any fights or quarrels. Things began to change when the war broke out in 1939. Within 2-3 months, things started to happen to the Jews. By late summer, around Tisha B'Av, they deported hundreds and hundreds of Jews, marched them to the railway stations, loaded them in cattle cars, and they took them away. We didn't know where. Within a month or 2 after this, there came out a law that all Jews needed to wear stars. I remember 2 neighbors who lived across the street from us, and we were very friendly. He used to come over and talk to my father for hours. And all of a sudden, they would not talk to us, they would not come over. It was like we didn't exist. In the morning, men used to go to the synagogue to pray. Townspeople would put on their beards and beat them up. Young boys, the same. And they used to go into Jewish stores and just loot the store in daylight. It was just terribly frightening. My mother never let us out. She was terribly scared for us that we might be molested. My father died in February of 1944. 10 days later, my sister Valerie came from Khust and told us that the situation is getting very bad and we will probably be deported. The last moments leaving our home forever is one of my hardest things. I ran into the stable and I kissed my wonderful, beautiful cow that I loved. Her name was Muncie. And I kissed the cat, which was I just adored that cat. We were marched to the nearby city of Nasaw, and that was the ghetto. We were assigned a room with 3 other families. We were a total of 4 families. In one room, that is. Each room had 3 to 4 families. 4 weeks into the establishment of the ghetto, they started to transport people out of the ghetto, families, complete families, like 400 to 500 a day. They gathered us the day after Passover. They had us march to the railroad station. We passed through forests and farm countries. And I remember once or twice they would not wave to us, but they would take their hand and they would show us like this, that we are going to be slaughtered. After 3 days, we arrived to Auschwitz. And that was a terrible shock. We could see buildings. They had gigantic chimneys, very, very tall chimneys, many of them, many. And there was a terrible flame coming out from them and a terrible stench. Some men approached our train and they spoke Yiddish. They said in a low voice, "If you have a child, give it to your mother. If you have a younger sister, she should go with your mother." As we went another few feet, maybe another 5, 6 to 7 feet away from the cattle car, they were officers, German officers. We knew we were doomed. We were all being separated, and there my mother just left, holding my little sister's hand, and didn't even say goodbye to her. And then the 3 sisters, Haichu, Esther, and me, We entered this big room. They told us to sit down on a chair, and they removed our hair. And then they directed me in another area to undress, completely naked. We were pointed at a heap of clothes. We picked up a dress, no panties, no bras. We were left barefoot, and we were led into a block, which was number 19. Within a few days, we were covered with lice. We were talking about whether we could ever see our parents again. A woman was pointing to the chimney, and she said, "That's where your mothers have gone. Stop carrying on." And when I see the gorgeous sunsets here, I compare it to the red himmels, to the red skies that were continuous there. Somehow, it just tears my heart out. The selections were held about a week or maybe a few days after we arrived, to line up in rows of people, one in front of the other. There stood Mengele with other SS, men and women. We had to raise our hand, and I was completely naked, so he could see if I had any muscle left, of the ribs, of whether they still had any covering of flesh. He would point to the right. Those were the condemned people. I, including my sisters, we went to the kitchen on the garbage dump, and we would take peels of beets and rub it on our cheeks to make our cheeks look more alive. One particular time, there was a selection of very healthy-looking, blonde, stramme, hoge girls, which means very, very good-looking, healthy-looking, blonde women. And not many will be selected. So it will be a very special selection. I was selected, and a few others were selected, a total of about 27 or 29. We were led to the very front of the lager, where it said Arbeit macht frei. This is the first time that I ever left my sisters, that we, the four of us, were separated. And at one point, I had a feeling that we weren't watched very carefully. So I started to back off, and I started running. Luckily, there were still many people coming and going, so I could not be detected that easily. When I came to my sister, they couldn't believe their eyes, and there was very emotional few minutes. Within 2 weeks, we were selected out of the camp. We were en route for about 2 days, not knowing where we are going or what will happen to us. And we worked in a factory, and we could see large, gigantic, big letters, Siemens Electronics. We did that all day for 12 hours. And we were there until about January, the end of January 1945. The Allied forces really made up their mind to destroy the German factories and production of military supplies. So we had 3 times a day bombing. The Siemens factory was completely destroyed, so they divided us into 2 different groups. Valerie was taken away from us and into another group. We didn't want that. We just couldn't take any more, and we carried on terribly. I carried on especially. I went up, there was a 3rd floor. I ran up the staircase and threatened to jump from the 3rd floor unless they let Valerie come with us, or we should go with Valerie. Therefore, many civilians were standing around and watching what was going on. The SS came up and forced me go down, and I refused. So they pushed me down, they threw me down the stairway into the basement and started beating me and kicking me, and consequently I have a crack in my skull, which is here forever. But after this incident, they did let Valerie come with us. At the beginning of May, we had small, tiny little windows, And I look outside and I see some men are crawling on their bellies. They are holding on to a rifle and crawling on their bellies in a long ditch. I put my hand, and he motioned me, put his finger on his lips, motioning me to be quiet. I put my hands together in prayer, and I showed him that I am grateful. Within 4 to 5 minutes after this incident, you could hear shots ringing out, revolver, rifle shots, and they killed all the guards. They came in to our place, to our building, and they said, "We are free," and that tomorrow afternoon the Americans should be arriving with their tanks. The first time in our lives that we had ever seen Americans. The feeling I cannot describe. When we arrived to the shores of America, and we had seen, they pointed out Ellis Island from the distance, and then we had seen the Statue of Liberty, and we all broke down. I met my husband in April of 1948. His family, the Rosenscheins, they all perished. Everyone. We fell in love, the biggest blessing in my life. I have 3 daughters. I know they are affected by my life and by Felix's terrible loss of his family. But I would like him to be happy and go on like any normal American would.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, my name's Karen Rosenschein, and I am Irene's middle daughter. I just want to take a minute on behalf of my sisters and our entire family to thank you for coming and to thank Larry for establishing this fund in my mother's honor. Frankly, she would have never believed that this could happen. And it was towards the end of my mother's life that she started teaching people about the Holocaust. And I think she was able to do that because this community loved her so much and welcomed her so much. So thank you so much. And we're very happy to have you here and to have Dr. Nasaw here as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm Nancy Lipsey. I'm the Senior Director of Programs here at the Boulder Jccc. I'm going to introduce our speaker this morning. David Nasaw is the author of many books. They are so notable that the New York Times and the Pulitzer Prize Committee and the New York Historical Society have mentioned them all multiple times. They include, and you may be familiar with many of these other titles, The Patriarch, about Joseph Kennedy, The Chief, The Life of William Randolph Hearst, and Andrew Carnegie. Until recently, he served as the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at the CUNY Graduate Center. After David's talk, there will be time for questions, and there'll be books available for sale and for signing at the end of the talk. David.
Thank you. Thank you all. Can we take that light off? And maybe bring the lights down a little so I can see who I'm talking to. I'm delighted to be here and very moved by the presentation and moved to be able to be part of this event and this celebration. And I congratulate you all on what is an extraordinary JCC and the activities that go on here. And I'm pleased to be part of it. I'm going to tell the story of the last 2 or 3 years of Irene's life, of Irene's time in Europe. This is a forgotten part of the history of the Jewish people, of the history of the Holocaust, of the history of the Cold War and the World War. In Jewish history and Holocaust history, we jump. We jump from VE Day and liberation to Anne Frank and the Eichmann trials and the awareness of what had happened in the Holocaust. In US history and European history, we leap from VE Day to the beginnings of the Cold War in 1948. In Jewish history, we leap from the Holocaust to the founding of the State of Israel. What we do not pay attention to is the fact that when VE Day came, when liberation came for the Jewish survivors, the sun shone. Tears of joy replaced tears of hardship. But liberation did not mean that their new lives began at once. My story is of the 3 to 5 years in which a million refugees, most of them innocent people, stuck in Germany when the war was over because they had no homes to return to, like the Jews, or they preferred not to go home, like millions of Polish refugees who did not want to start life over again in a devastated land that was now controlled by Soviet puppets. The third group did not want to go home because they had committed atrocities during the war and knew if they returned to Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Yugoslavia, Romania, they would be rightly punished for all that they had done. So let me briefly introduce the last million and why they were in Germany. When the war was over and the survivors, the Jewish survivors and the refugees, can you see, do you want the lights lower? Can everybody see? Yeah, it's okay? Down? Could you bring the lights down a little bit? Every one of the last million, the Americans were going to put them in displaced persons camps until they could return home. These displaced persons camps were run by the United Nations Refugee and Rehabilitation Administration. But before they could go anywhere, they had to be deloused, which was a humiliating experience. But after what these people had been through, they accepted it, they understood it. This is a group of Polish displaced persons. How did they get into Germany? They were kidnapped by the Germans, and they were sent not to camps, they were sent to Germany to work on the farms, the factories, the roads, all the jobs that the German men who were now fighting in the East had once occupied. Hitler and the Third Reich felt it was their duty. They could do whatever the hell they wanted. And they rounded up literally millions of non-Jewish Eastern Europeans, brought them into Germany and put them to work. Hitler sent out a special memo. I don't know if he did memos at that time. That's probably a directive, orders. He said, you know, the Ukrainians are Untermenschen. They're not really people. But there is some German blood there. So look for the blondest Ukrainians you can find and send them, and they can be the nannies in Jewish households. All the rest of the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Russians worked at factories. They were dreadfully mistreated. They too had to wear emblems with P's or O's for East European or P's for Polish. When war is over, these millions of foreigners, of civilians, including the small group who had survived the Holocaust of Jews, they wander the streets. They're starving, they're homeless. The Americans pick them up, the British pick them up, round them up, and transport them to assembly centers. This is a group of Poles. As you can see, the Poles mistreated are a healthy-looking group. We cannot equate what went on with the foreign workers, the slave laborers, with what went on with the Jewish survivors. Yet they too were stuck for 3 to 5 years in Germany when the war was over. This is one Polish girl showing the other Polish girls in a displaced persons camp, her tattoo, her Nazi tattoo. Whether she is showing it in horror or in joy, we do not know from this picture. A third group, besides the Jews, who we will talk about in a minute, and the Polish displaced persons, were the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians. They were treated differently by the Germans because Hitler, in his insane racial ordering, put the Latvians and the Lithuanians above the Poles, above the Ukrainians, and allowed them a little bit more leeway, a little bit more self-administration when he occupied their country. When the war was over, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, thousands of them, because they had collaborated in one way or another with the German occupiers, knew that they had to leave Latvia. Why? Because either an independent Latvia or a Soviet-dominated Latvia was going to punish the collaborators. The collaborators included not only Latvians and Lithuanians who worked in the post office or worked for the government, the occupying government, but a large number of auxiliary policemen, of Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian men who joined foreign divisions of the Waffen-SS. And they fled. This is a long line of Baltic refugees on their way to Germany, where they thought they would be safe. When the war is over, they too, homeless, unable to return home, end up in the displaced persons camps. The smallest group among the last million were the Jews, because not many survived. Large numbers of those who survived at Bergen-Belsen. down about a mile away from the concentration camp were these rather luxurious quarters where the camp guards and the SS lived, again, in splendor. When the war was over, all of those who had survived at Bergen-Belsen were moved down the road to the quarters that the Germans had occupied. And the camp was burned. The camp was burned not symbolically. These are British soldiers watching it. But the camp was burned because it was such a center of disease, of typhus, that to protect the German population, the camp had to be burned down. The Jewish survivors were a small number of those who were among the displaced persons. And those who ended their lives in Germany, or who were in Germany, the Jews, at the end of the war, were brought there because, like Irene, at the end of the war, the Germans decided that their labor shortage was such that it would be better to work the Jews to death than to gas them. And that decision saved lives. From Birkenau, from the camps in Poland, Jews were death marched back into Germany, most of them to work in underground armaments factories, which Hitler believed somehow would produce magic weapons that would end the war. The factories were underground, so they could not be bombed from the air. The life expectancy within these factories was a couple of months, 3 to 6 months. Some French prisoners of war were put down there, but it was mostly staffed by Jews. By the time the war was over, 2 and 3 and 5, 2/3 of the Jews who had been brought into Germany had indeed been worked to death. The camps were opened, and no one knew how many Jews had survived. The American soldiers didn't speak Yiddish. The British soldiers didn't speak Yiddish. Many of the Jewish survivors did. They were too weak. They were too fragile. They were too diseased. They were too frightening looking to gather much attention, except for a group of Jewish chaplains. The American Army had Jewish chaplains who spent their time in Germany. And the story of these Jewish chaplains is, I could write a book about the Jewish chaplains. They deserted. They were supposed to hold services for the Jewish soldiers. The war is over, and they say, to hell with the Jewish soldiers. They're on their own. We are going to spend our time with the survivors. And there's one incredible story I tell in my book of one of the Jewish chaplains. He walks through, I don't know whether it's Bergen-Belsen or Buchenwald, one of the camps. And he says in Yiddish, I'm here. I'm here to help. Is anybody Jewish? And he begins to collect people. And then to warn the soldiers not to feed the survivors too much. The American people know nothing about this. Nothing. One of the astounding things I learned in doing my research, I read newspaper article after newspaper article. Dwight David Eisenhower is so astounded, so tormented by what he finds in the concentration camps, that he asks Marshall, George Marshall, who's the chief of staff, can he please send every major American publisher and editor and newsreel producer to look at the camps? And they arrive and they tour the camps and they write editorials and they take pictures and there are newsreels. And Edward R. Murrow visits Buchenwald and gives his famous report on what he has found at Buchenwald. Nobody mentions the Jews. Nobody. Why? Because they're a small group of the survivors. And again, they speak Yiddish, they're too sick, they're too frightened to stand out. But the Jewish chaplains won't let this happen. They won't let these people be forgotten. And they write home. They write home to their congregations. They write to their families. They write to their local newspapers. They write to their congressmen. And eventually the story of the Jewish survivors, that there are Jewish survivors in Germany, gets to Morgenthau. Robert Morgenthau, who is the only Jewish member of Roosevelt's cabinet and Truman's cabinet. And Morgenthau makes a fuss. Morgenthau, who was a very secular Jew, who was not a member of any Jewish communities during the war and prior to the war, he goes to the State Department and he says something must be done. And Truman sends a investigator by the name of Earl Harrison. He picks the waspiest guy he can find, a man who was, I don't know whether he was born a Presbyterian and becomes a Quaker, or born some other denomination and becomes a Quaker, is at the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He sends Harrison, and Harrison visits the camps, and Harrison comes back, and Harrison says to Truman, and Truman, to his credit, Truman in my book comes off much better than I thought he would. And Truman, to his credit, meets with Harrison, and he reads his report. And in that report, Harrison says, we, the American government, the American army, we are treating the Jews as badly as the Germans did, except we're not exterminating them. We're putting them in camps. We're putting them in camps where they are the minority. We're putting them in camps with Polish and Latvians and Ukrainians who might have been their tormentors. We are not giving them enough food to eat. We are not giving them medicine. We are not allowing them to practice their faith. And Truman writes to Eisenhower, and he says to Eisenhower, take care of this. And Eisenhower takes care of it. And the Jews are moved, with the help of American soldiers, into displaced persons camps that are for Jews only. Eisenhower gives the Jews their own camps. And Eisenhower, on Yom Kippur, visits one of the Jewish camps, and in a moment of solidarity goes into the synagogue for the services, while George Patton curses outside. George Patton keeps a diary. George Patton dies a young man before he can destroy his diary, and leaves it to historians like me to read. And in the diary he says, writes, what the hell is Eisenhower doing? He's given in to these Jews back in the United States. The Jewish displaced persons they're vermin. They're they're disgusting. They're not human beings. Why is Eisenhower doing this? But Eisenhower does it. The camps are set up, displaced persons camps. The Jews have their own, the Lithuanians have their own. They become little communities in exile. This is the Lithuanians' kindergarten that is set up in one of the Lithuanian camps. What's remarkable is one of these little girls, I don't know which one, I'm not going to try to point her out. I got a letter after my book was published by a woman in Mississippi, and she said, that's my grandmother there in the front row. The number of Jews in the camps is tiny. It's 30 to 50,000 out of 1 million. And then in 1946, late 1945, early 1946, Stalin, for reasons historians are debating to this day, says to the 500,000 Jews, Polish Jews, who had survived the war because they had escaped to the Soviet Union, where they spent 4 to 5 years at hard labor. They were free. They were not in camps. They were not in the gulag. But they, like all of the Soviet citizens and the Polish refugees, will work nearly to death to provide the Red Army with the goods that were needed. 80% of Polish Jewry, and the Polish Jews were the largest percentage of Jews in Europe. 80% of those that survived because they were able to escape into the Soviet Union. When the war is over, again, for reasons we don't know, Stalin says to the Jews, you can go home now. He provides trains to bring them home. This is before his crazy anti-Semitism, Stalin's. The Jews come back to Poland, and what do they discover? They discover that anti-Semitism is as bad, if not worse, than it was. That the Germans had poisoned the Polish population. And the church had done nothing about it. The Jews who had escaped, survived in the Soviet Union, come back to Poland. And they quickly discover that they cannot live in Poland. In June of 1946, there is a dreadful pogrom at Kilcha. These are the Jews mourning, the Jews who had been killed. In the background, if you look, you can see Polish citizens looking on. Whether they're looking on in horror, amusement, or at the spectacle, we don't know. From 1946 on, especially after Kilcha, the Jews leave. The Jews leave. And where there had once been 50,000 Jewish survivors in the camps, the numbers now rise to 250,000. 250,000 Jewish survivors in displaced persons camps in Germany. These are the Jews on their escape route out of Poland. They come through Austria, where they're put up in barracks, old army barracks, on their way into Germany. It is one of the great ironies. I have to stop myself from wandering because we're being live streamed. As an old college professor, I would wander up and down, but I will stay in my place here. As the Jewish survivors move into the camps, the displaced persons camps now, they create an extraordinary culture. These are people like Irene, who are full of life and who make a decision that they cannot give themselves the luxury of mourning. That they are the last remnant, the surviving remnant, and they have to keep the Jewish community alive. They have to rebuild, resuscitate it. And they do so in the displaced persons camps because no place on earth will accept them. The British won't let them into Palestine. The Americans won't let them into the United States. So they are in this limbo. But again, instead of, mourning their faith, they create a culture. They have boxing and chess tournaments within each of these camps. This is 250,000 Jews. And between the different displaced persons camps. They have concerts. They revivify the Jewish cultural traditions. And can anybody guess who that man is conducting them? Leonard Bernstein, yes. Bernstein comes to visit the Berlin Philharmonic. He conducts the Berlin Philharmonic and he says, I want to go to the camps. And he brings some musicians with him and others are already there. David Ben-Gurion arrives at the camps and he says to the survivors, we will find a way. We will find a way to get you to Palestine. We don't know when, we don't know how, but we will do it. And Ben-Gurion shuts down the debate that goes on within the Jewish agency. There are those in the Jewish agency who says, we're going to be at war with the Arabs soon. We don't want all these sick people. We'll pick and choose. And Ben-Gurion says, no. Any Jew who wants to come, if we have to bring them to Israel on stretchers, we will bring them. And this is what he is telling the survivors at the camps. This is a group of young Jews who are preparing for Palestine. And they're preparing for Palestine in a special kibbutz that's attached to one of the camps, where they, with the help of Jews from Palestine, they're learning to farm. They allow themselves to have pictures taken with their hoes, but they're also learning to fight and learning to wield weapons because they know that when they get to Palestine, they will be fighters and farmers. Beginning in 1947, after 2 years, the United Nations and the international community and the United States and the British, they figure out that they can't keep 1 million refugees in Europe, in Germany forever. That they got to get them out of there. That the Poles are not going to go home, the Latvians are not going to go home, the Ukrainians are not going to go home. So the Americans and the British set up a new organization, which they call the International Refugee Organization, and they set up what one worker in the camps calls a meat market. They invite government representatives from Brazil, from Canada, from South Africa, from all over the world to come to the camps and to interview and pick and choose people they want for resettlement. And the Latvians are everybody's first choice. And the Lithuanians. Nobody wants the Jews. Nobody wants the Jews. There is a brief moment, in which the Canadian Jews, who are small in number but quite organized, arrange a special immigration quota of tailors, half of which are going to be Jews. And what happens at the camps? There's a special onrush of lawyers, doctors, professors to learn to sew so that they can get into Canada as tailors. And again, a relative of the man with the cap at the front contacted me and said, thanked me for filling in the rest of the story of her, I think, great-grandfather. Among those who are invited to resettle in Australia, Canada, all over the world, hundreds of thousands of this last million, are large numbers of collaborators, of Waffen-SS members, of auxiliary policemen, of war criminals. But nobody seems to care. It is the beginning of the Cold War. And what every government and every people is now saying in 1947, 1948, 1949, Hitler's dead, the Nazis are defeated. If these former collaborators are now anti-Soviet, then that's all that matters to us. Not that they were once pro-Nazi, but that they're now anti-Soviet. So we'll see later in the lecture. We'll talk about the number of collaborators who enter Australia, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and every other nation on earth. What do the Jews do? Nobody's going to take the Jews. So the Jews begin what they call the illegal Aliyah bet. They are going to smuggle themselves into Palestine. This is two young Jews from the camps. They had survived. They had survived the camps, and they had been chosen to go on the Exodus. And they are in Marseille, from where the ship the Exodus is going to leave. And they have a day off from their training, and they're strolling the streets of Marseille. This is parents saying goodbye at Bergen-Belsen, at the displaced persons camp that had been established in the German headquarters at Bergen-Belsen. And they're saying goodbye to their young man who was on his way to Palestine. They don't know if they'll ever see him again. They don't know what his future will be. But they are, with tears, saluting and celebrating the fact that he is going to leave Germany. It is one of the historical ironies that it's hard to wrap your mind around. That in 1945, 46, 47, 48, 49, the only safe place for the majority of European Jews, including the Poles, was displaced persons camps in Germany. In June of 1948, 3 years after VE Day, the United States of America finally begins to accept, for special immigration, displaced persons. But guess what? The law that is written so that 90% of the Jews are kept out. The law is written so that if you entered Germany and one of the displaced persons camps after December of 1945, you were ineligible for a displaced persons visa. And remember, if you can remember back 15 minutes ago, the majority of Jewish survivors in the camps had spent the war in hiding in the Soviet Union, or when the war was over, they had left Germany to go back to Poland to find family members. And they had not come back into Germany until 1946. America welcomes U.S. new citizens. There is enormous attention paid as the displaced persons enter the United States. The Poles, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Yugoslavs, all non-Jews. The law of 1948 is eventually changed so that Jews can enter. But by the time the law is changed, Israel has been founded. And the United States of America has recognized the state of Israel. The traditional historical interpretation says that Harry Truman had a friend, okay, I'm forgetting his name, who remembers his, who was a haberdasher with him, a Jewish haberdasher, and that Truman is convinced by this Jewish haberdasher, you got to do something for the Jews, and Truman is a reader of the Bible, and he thinks the Jews should go back to Israel. And that's why he recognizes the state of Israel. I'll tell you why he recognizes the state of Israel. Because there are 250,000 Jews in Germany. And he knows that he cannot establish an independent and free and self-governing West Germany while there are 250,000 Jews behind barbed wire in refugee camps. He's got to get them out of there. He can't get them into the United States. He can't get them into Canada or Australia. So he promotes the partition and he recognizes the state of Israel. In the end, it's hard to get these figures, but I think I've got them right. Some 50,000 Jewish survivors come to the United States under the DP Acts. 150,000 or more go to Israel. Some because they are Zionists and want to go to Israel. Many more because they have no choice. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Jews who had survived the war and 3 to 5 years in displaced persons camps to then be told, well, you can go to Israel, but guess what? There's a war going on. And we don't know how long it will go on, and we don't know whether the Jewish state is going to survive. But you've got no choice. So many of those Jews who eventually, who go to Israel, come back to the United States. The Jews are shut out, but a large number of collaborators enter the United States. Carlinus, accused of atrocities at a concentration camp in Estonia, lives a happy life in Green Lawn, Long Island, until April 1987. Bishop Trifa, the leader of the Romanian Iron Guard, lives in the United States until 1982. He dies a free man in 1987. Yakiv Polish, a Ukrainian guard in several camps. He's removed from Queens, New York in 2018, the last survivor, 16 years after deportation hearings. The story of I don't want to leave his image there as I complete my talk. In the 1970s, Liz Holtzman, anybody remember Liz Holtzman? Okay. Liz Holtzman from Brooklyn is told by an INS official that there's a list of collaborators and war criminals, okay? There's a list of collaborators and war criminals who entered the United States illegally or legally. What do I mean illegally? They had lied, said that they weren't war collaborators, and then come into the United States. She begins what ends up with the establishment of a unit within the Justice Department that seeks out the collaborators. And once the United States begins to do this, 40 years too late, England, Canada, Australia do the same. In the end, history is served, but justice is not, because these people live full lives hiding their past. Okay, let me end with the story of Itsek and Lola Lachman. I met Itsek and Lola just before the COVID crisis at a assisted living or nursing home in Little Neck, Long Island. And Lola was in a wheelchair, and she had a stroke and couldn't speak. Itsek was doing fine, except he had moments of fury because his short-term memory was gone, and he didn't remember that his wife couldn't speak. So when he spoke to her, they laughed at this, and his family laughed at this, so I will too. When he would ask her a question and she wouldn't answer, he'd get angry. And the nurses would have to come in and explain over and over and over again what had happened. Itsek was, with tears in his eyes, tells me the incredible story of how he met Lola. Both of them had been survivors of any number of camps, and had ended up in Dachau, and then had ended up in one of the displaced persons camps. And after his travail, all he wanted to do, Itsek, was to do work. He was a carpenter. He didn't want to work for the Nazis. That's how he had survived. He wanted to work for his own people. And in the camp, he was told that in the girls' dormitory, we need someone to build bunk beds. This is I forget which camp it is. It's in my book. And he went into the girls' dormitory, and he sees a young girl who he recognizes from a resort town in Poland, where he had seen her, he claims, when he was 16 and she was 15. They marry. have a child in the displaced persons camps than 2 more in Brooklyn. He gets into the United States because a chaplain says, do you have any relatives in the United States? And he says, I think I have some in Brooklyn. So the chaplain writes a notice that he sends to all the Yiddish papers, the Jewish papers, and someone in the forwards gets it to his relatives. And they arrange to bring him and Lola and the child to Brooklyn, find them a job, find them housing. And now, at age 99, I believe, he looks at me. He looks at me with tears in his eyes next to his wife. And he says, I want you to know one thing. He says, it couldn't be a better life. I have a good wife. We've been married for 70 years. I have children. I have grandchildren. It's a good life. So I want to end with the story of Irene and of Itsek and Lola Lachman, who, despite the horrors that they had gone through, lived. And they lived full lives. They hid the pain. They banished the tears. They looked forward to create a world in which there would never be a Hitler again. And in the end, we must salute and celebrate them as we are doing today and as you are doing. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It is really a difficult topic for me particularly to listen to, and I commend you for bringing it into the limelight. My family and myself were in the very last wave of the displaced persons, inhabitants, in an era that is a little bit later, out of Latvia in 1956. This was when the agreement between Khrushchev and Gomulka allowed Polish citizens to repatriate to Poland. My father was from Belarus at the time. That was initially Polish and then Russian. So we were housed in those DP camps throughout Poland for almost a year until we found shelter in the bombed out building in Legnica, where we stopped being shuttled from one DP camp to another. And I don't know if you addressed that in your book about that wave of refugees. There were several thousands of us who managed to escape the gulag of the Soviet Union and ultimately make it to Israel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wish I had been able to take my book beyond 1950, 1951, but I was not. Yet I recognize that the story I tell in this book is a partial story, and that there are many stories of individuals who were left out, but should not have been. Are there other questions?
Not a question, but a comment. Your book made me realize how many times when we study history, it was like after the war, the displaced persons were put in the camp, and then they were fed, and they were clothed, and then this happened, and it wasn't like that at all. It was so complicated.
Yeah.
It was amazing, and they didn't really quite know what to do at first because it had never happened before. and people debating this and that, and letters sent here. It's a wonderful book. Thank you. Thank you. And also, one thing that really struck me is in the DP camp, when you said there were no older people and there were no kids.
Yeah.
Entire generations gone.
Right.
And lastly, Truman's Taylor's name, Eddie Jacobson.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I've forgotten that. Yeah, what's remarkable is that there are really two different moments in histories of the displaced person camp. When the Polish Jews start coming, in the beginning, the people at the displaced persons camps say, how are we going to take care of these people? How are we going to expand, our facilities and our food from 50,000 to 250,000? And then they say we must. And there is an infusion of energy when the Polish Jews arrive. The highest birth rate in the world at that time was in the Jewish displaced persons camps. Once the Polish survivors come in, who are of child rearing age, as some of the younger survivors became by 1948, 1949, for a variety of reasons, but also because it's their responsibility to rebuild the Jewish community. The birth rate is incredible. You see lots of pictures in the displaced persons camps of baby carriages lined up. It's like the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where you can't walk down the street without running into strollers. Are there other questions? If not, let me, I will give Nancy, and she can get it to you, my email address, because every place I've spoken, this is the first place I've spoken live, and it is a joy. I've spoken to thousands of people on Zoom, and it just ain't the same, believe me. But I've given my email address is dnasaw, and Nancy can share it with people. dnasaw@gc.cuny.edu. And I invite people who have comments or questions to please get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to speak further to you. And also, we're going outside, right?
One more question.
Thanks for that presentation, and I guess my first comment is I had not personally learned about this in my education, and I guess one question, it's just kind of a general question, not a detailed question, but how do we disseminate this information to more people in a more global fashion so that people are aware of what happened, so that these things don't happen again? I just wonder how that, if people have thought about like how to make it bigger.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the ways to do it is that we have to extend. We have to extend chronologically our understanding of what the Shoah was. I mean, the Shoah lives as long as the survivors live. I mean, they carry it with them. That's number one. Number two, for the Jewish survivors, again, this is part of their history. And this is part of their history of their tragedy and of their triumph. And therefore, I think it should be part of Holocaust education. I hope that following the publication of this book, there'll be more articles and more attention paid to this. But I thank you.
Well, that was a great final question because it leads me into this is why we have these lectures, and I'm so grateful for all of you to be here, and David for the incredible lecture and also book that he brought to us of a way to be able to learn a different aspect of the Holocaust and what happens afterwards. So I'm Jonathan Lev, I'm Executive Director at the Boulder JCC. I've met some of you I have not met before, which is, I'm hoping to get to meet in person, which is so great. I'm glad that so many of you are here in person with us, and also to those who are live streaming, thank you for joining us as well. For those of you who are here, we want to invite you in the courtyard. We have coffee and tea for you to be able to enjoy afterwards, and also there are books that David is here to be able to sign, and the Boulder Bookstore who has partnered with us to bring them here. I want to also thank Karen, Gail, and Bev, and the entire Rosenschein family for being here, for helping us learn more about the legacy of your mother and bringing that to our community. And Larry, thank you for establishing this fund, and so many of the donors, and some of you are here, to our endowed fund. If you're interested, as Larry mentioned, please go to our website. You can click donate and you select endowment. And you can select the Irene Rosenschein Holocaust Education Fund and be part of this legacy for us to be able to continue to bring education programs like this to all ages in the community. We came off a huge and busy week of Hanukkah at the JCC, and we have a lot of more programs coming up. Please check out our website for more information. There's both in-person and Zoom options for those that are interested. And lastly, I just want to make sure that I thank all of you for being here. Stay safe, and thank you for joining us today.